Just a warning before we start, this episode contains historical records that use racist and offensive language and descriptions of events that will be distressing to some listeners. We'll link some services at the end of this episode, but please take care while listening. Regid Ahmed here on Gadigal land with the full story. Today we're bringing you the final episode of a special two-part series from Guardian Australia. It's called The Descendants. Indigenous Affairs reporter Ella Archibald-Binge travels to central Queensland in search of the truth behind allegations that the pioneering founder of the AFL perpetuated colonial massacres. Here's host Lorena Allam.
Back in the mid-1800s, there was no town. Here was just a dirt track running around the mountain here and went out to Tambo and Blackall.
The town of Springshore is about 300 kilometres west of Rockhampton in central Queensland.
It was all just sheep and squatters living out here in the early days.
The town's colonial history is everywhere. Stone monuments telling you about the district's early pioneers, sepia photos outside shop fronts, even track marks in the sandstone rocks.
Bullock drays loaded up were so heavy that they cracked the sandstone, and then when the next rains come, it washes it out, and then when the next one goes through it cracks the sand.
Not as obvious is the history of the Gayiri people who lived in the region for thousands of years. But their presence is felt in the landscape, in the scar trees, in the craggy mountains that overlook the town.
Look out here up on that, look out up there, on that peninsula up there, looking down.
This is The Descendants, a two-part full story about Australia's reckoning with the truth of its colonial past. I'm Lorena Allam, and this is episode 2, Springshore and the Legacy of Tom Wills. Joining me is Ella Archibald-Binge. Ella, welcome.
Thanks, Lorena.
So, Ella, this story starts with Tom Wills. How did you come to be interested in him? Who's Tom Wills?
So Tom Wills is basically Australia's first sporting hero. He was a very talented cricketer. He's also widely credited with creating the game of AFL. So he's been widely recognised for that, and to the point that he's got his own statue outside the MCG, and he's a big deal. And so 4 years ago, there were a few stories that the ABC published which suggested that Tom Wills, this huge sporting figure, may have been involved in massacring Aboriginal people in Queensland. So as you can imagine, that caused a huge uproar. And we'd read those stories and they left us wondering, I guess, firstly, was it true? And if so, what were the implications of that in terms of how this person should be remembered? We really wanted to investigate that further, and we thought the best way to do that was to go up to central Queensland where this story began. So my colleague, photographer Ellen Smith, and I did that to find out for ourselves.
So tell me about Springshore. What's it like?
It's an interesting sort of place. It's very remote, small town, sort of that classic one main street. There are, as you say, lots of reminders of that colonial history. It sort of does feel like a bit of a monument to those early pioneers as they're referenced. But yeah, there is very little mention of that Aboriginal history, but you really can feel it. There's something spiritual about the place and these spectacular mountains that are kind of this dramatic backdrop to the main street. And, it's like 9 hours to get there from Brisbane, so a decent drive, which we did with, as I say, my colleague Ellen, as well as John McPherson, who's a former journalist in his 60s.
Hello, how are you going?
How do you do?
9 hours is a long time in the car together. Mm-hmm. How did you get to know John? And tell us a bit more about him.
My sons.
Yeah, perfect. That was only
Yes, so John is a descendant, I suppose, of the Wills family. He's descended from Tom Wills' auntie. He's done a lot of work looking at, I guess, sporting history, and he, many years ago, was doing a PhD looking at the origins of AFL and the influences on the game when he came across this possible link between Tom Wills and these killings that happened up around what is now Springshore. And he had spent a lot of time reckoning with this personally. When we had a chat over the phone, he mentioned he'd always wanted to go up there and see this place where it happened and to meet the Aboriginal people who were still there.
I realise that we're going to be going to massacre sites and burial grounds, and that will be challenging. Well, let's understand what's gone down, and this is where people can understand why apologies are appropriate for past issues.
So yeah, we were able to go on that journey with him.
And what were you hoping to find once you got to Springshore?
So the first thing we tried to do was to find another Wills descendant who lived just out of town. His name is also Tom Wills, and we drove out to his cattle station.
Holler and see if someone's around.
He wasn't there, unfortunately. So the next thing we did was go to the Tourist Information Centre, asked them if they knew how we could get in touch with him. They gave us a phone number, which we tried, but no one picked up. And while we were there was kind of an interesting moment because John asked the volunteer if they had much information about the Aboriginal history of the area, which she seemed a bit surprised at the question, sort of said there wasn't much at all about the Aboriginal history. So we kind of realised we had to dig a little deeper.
How did the Wills family end up in Springshore?
So they'd come up from Victoria. So Tom came up with his father, Horatio, and with them they had about 10,000 sheep and a few dozen people. So that took about 8 months. And they'd come up to take possession of a station called Cullen Luringo. So the frontier was moving north, helped by the native police, which were these contingents of Aboriginal troopers led by white officers who had the job of protecting the settlers and punishing any Aboriginal people who resisted. One author described the native police as a brutal collection of killers led by sadists.
So the native police were operating at the time around Cullen Luringo. What other colonisers were around?
Yep. Next door to Cullen Luringo was Rainworth Station, which was run by a guy called Jesse Gregson. So a few months before Horatio and Tom Wills turned up, Gregson had gone looking for some lost sheep and he asked the native police to come with him. They found them with a group of Gayiri people. According to native police records, at least 4 Gayiri people were shot. And Horatio and Tom Wills and the rest of that party didn't really know a whole lot about these conflicts when they got to Cullen Luringo.
So they had a very different relationship with mob in Victoria before they got to Queensland, didn't they?
That's right. So Horatio had developed good relations with the Jumbunna people at his sheep farm in Victoria. And by all accounts, he was quite optimistic about this new venture in Queensland, but maybe didn't realise how tense things had become in this part of the state. And there are accounts to suggest that Tom was a bit more wary of what was going on.
Tom could tell that there was something different up here. And he tried to warn Horatio, but Horatio still had this belief that all would be good.
The tension was building, as often is the case on the frontier, tension over land and cattle and sheep. All of this was building around the property Cullen Luringo. Ella, maybe it's time to talk about what happened at that place.
Yeah, for a bit of context, obviously it's very hot in Queensland at this time of the year, quite different to Victoria, and Horatio and his workers had formed this habit of taking a siesta in the afternoons to kind of escape the heat. So after lunch one day, he was resting in his tent in the bushland on his property when the attack began. 19 men, women and children were killed. And their deaths were reported in the newspapers at the time in a lot of graphic detail.
A couple of workers survived, and one of them later spoke about being woken by loud and violent talking, followed by screams, shouts, and the dull crash of terrible blows, which signalled that the work of death had begun.
So this was a huge attack that really shocked, I suppose, the colony. Horatio's son Tom survived. He was away getting supplies from a nearby town. The attack became known as the Cullen Luringo massacre, and it was Queensland's largest massacre of white settlers by Aboriginal people.
The mist's here, so it's sort of a slightly eerie feel about it, sort of struggling land. Graves.
So we drove out to where it happened and where the bodies were buried.
Memory of Horatio Spencer Wills of Victoria, aged 49 years, who, with his whole party consisting of 19 persons, men, women and children, were barbarously murdered by the blacks on this spot on the 17th of October 1861.
And this was with John, who's a descendant of the Wills family.
That's right. So this was the first time he had been there. He was seeing this spot where his ancestor spent his final moments, and where he was buried, where he was found.
Looking around here, this is where they started, 19 bodies.
So what happened after the news got out that this terrible thing had happened?
Yes, so a couple of the survivors, one of them rode to the neighbour's place. This is Jesse Gregson's place. And Gregson pulled together a group of settlers in the area who essentially went out looking for revenge, trying to find the people that had done this. And they found them within days. They came across this group of Gayiri people. It was the early hours of the morning and the camp was asleep. And again, the papers reported on what happened.
In a second, the stillness of the morning was broken by a loud report of a rifle. All was now confusion. The affray lasted only a few minutes, but several blacks lay dead where they had been peacefully sleeping only a short time before. This was the first lesson given to the blacks.
At least 30 people were murdered.
So Ella, while you were in Springshore, you also travelled around with Bidjara and Gungaloo man Darryl Black. Can you tell me how you met Darryl?
Yeah, so we weren't really able to find any Gayiri people who were still living in Springshore, but we were able to find Darryl. Essentially, he's a local knowledge holder, so he's heard these stories from his father, who was a very respected elder in that region, and he passes on those stories to tourists. He does a lot of cultural sessions in schools, and most afternoons he's kind of just hanging out at these tourist hotspots, just having a chat to them, trying to tell them about the Aboriginal history of the area, basically, or as he says, the history you won't read in the books.
I see some of these people when I'm trying to get them to come along and whatnot. I see the ones that's a bit standoffish and don't really want to do it, but the wife will want to do it and the husband's got to please her, so he'll come along. But you see, he's not too happy about it. But then I love it when these type of people come along, because if you can make change with them, then you know you're doing all right.
What was it like hanging out with Darryl and with John in that place?
Yeah, it was fascinating, and there was some interesting conversations between the two, and there were definitely some really quiet moments where you could feel everyone just processing what had happened, where we were standing, and the very different ways that it affected each of their people.
It was an interesting contrast. I remember you telling me about this because you're in the town of Springshore with its monuments to the pioneering spirit, but Darryl took you out on country to a very different atmosphere, yeah?
That's right, yeah. There was one spot in particular, just a quiet road off the highway, which wouldn't look like anything, if you didn't know what you were looking at. We got out of the car and we sort of looked across this paddock to a small mountain with a sheer cliff face at the top.
So basically this is where the native police caught up.
There was vigilantes and troopers.
Yep.
Chased them all the way through this range here.
Yeah.
And they pretty much, they shot them off the end of the hills here. And they were in view of their range. That's what gets me every time. They were nearly home. Yeah.
So there was more than one revenge attack after Cullen Luringo against the Gayiri people, wasn't there? This place that Darryl is showing you was where another revenge attack took place and people were, I think, driven off the cliff.
That's what seems to have happened. It's difficult with these reprisal attacks because unlike the earlier attack at Cullen Luringo, the details are quite scarce. So it's hard to get a definitive account of what happened. But Guardian Australia's massacre map shows that in the months that followed, there were at least 6 mass killings of Aboriginal people in the area. And there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald 2 months after this which reported that the Native Police killed 60 to 70 Gayiri people. Other records say there were up to 300 people killed and that the troopers only stopped firing when they ran out of ammunition.
So they went through pretty much all the vigilantes, all the troopers just went through the tribes and killed them all.
And you're saying that the bodies were just left there?
Just left there.
Where they fell?
Yeah. They were left there, just bleaching in the sun.
The Cullen Luringo massacre was a turning point in the frontier wars over control of Queensland's north. Over the coming decades, thousands of Aboriginal people would be killed.
So we know that the settlers had a lot to gain from the killings that happened right across the country, and this place was no different.
Yeah, so one of the things we wanted to do with this story was also see where, I guess, some of the key characters had ended up. And one of the people we looked at was the Rainworth station manager, Jesse Gregson, who had helped kill dozens of Aboriginal people in the Springshore region, both before and after Cullen Luringo. And he actually went on to become the longest-serving superintendent of the Australian Agricultural Company, better known today as AACO. And that company now owns and operates the country's largest cattle herd and has stations that cover almost 1% of Australia's land mass. 2 of its properties are outside Springshore. There's also a memorial park for Gregson in Newcastle where he'd been posted with the company.
So, Ella, you ended up speaking to a descendant of the Gayiri people who were killed in those massacres in Springshore. Tell us about him.
Yes, so his name is Yamba Conrad Ross. We tracked him down in Melbourne and we've had several conversations over the phone. And he first learnt that his family had been involved in some kind of massacre during this urgent conversation with one of his great uncles on his deathbed.
It's emotional because it felt like he needed to teach me as much as he could before he actually passed. And he knew he was about to pass. He shared a lot of old stories and even spoke some of the Gayiri language as well.
Yamba's uncle had talked about a slaughter and people hiding.
There was talk about a cow. Dead cows or horses, open them up, pull out the insides and actually hide inside.
Yamba has spent a lot of his life trying to find out who he is and where his people are from. His mum grew up on the mission at Woorabinda, away from her country. She wasn't allowed to speak her native language or acknowledge her culture, and her own mother had died young, so she didn't know who her people were.
And then towards the end of her passing, she talked about stories, like stuff that she'd forgotten.
So he eventually got hold of some documents from the Queensland State Archives confirming his ties to the Gayiri people, but he's found it really difficult to find details about this massacre of his ancestors. And in 2008, Yamba went to his country for the first time, spending 2 days in Springshore, which he found very unsettling. He told me he couldn't wait to leave.
I tried sleeping in town that night and I couldn't sleep. I was having nightmares.
And aside from his great uncle, Yamba hasn't been able to really track down many other Gayiri relatives at all.
I tried reaching out to a lot of people. There was none.
Okay.
And I'm like, wow, this is pretty bad.
So you're saying that Darryl Black has sort of taken on the responsibility of telling the history of what happened there, but it hasn't earned him many friends.
Yeah, he kind of does cut a bit of a lonely figure in that town. Yeah, and there was kind of an interesting moment on our last day in Springshore where I went back to the Tourist Information Centre and Darryl happened to be walking by and I've yelled out hello, we've had a bit of a chat. And I don't know if I've imagined it, but it felt like the mood in the centre shifts. Like the volunteer who had, just moments before been very friendly and helpful now seemed quite eager for us to leave. Darryl was unfazed. He's kind of used to this and he's at the tourist lookouts most afternoons, showing them these amazing artefacts that he's found in his travels in the mountains, these axe heads and grinding stones and the objects that are just rattling around in this supermarket basket in the backseat of his Land Cruiser. Yeah.
That's where everyone's got to deal with their past. You can't just ignore stuff from the past and move forward like it's not going to affect you. It's there mentally. It'll be there. It'll affect you every day of the week. Yeah.
So what about Tom Wills, the original Tom Wills, because we've got more than one Tom Wills in this story. After his father died, what happened to him?
So Tom Wills Sr. eventually moved back to Melbourne. He wasn't really cut out for farming life, as it turns out. He actually went on to coach the first Aboriginal cricket team in Victoria, which later went on to tour England, although Tom Wills wasn't involved by that stage. But he had long had problems with alcohol, and ultimately that alcoholism ended his sporting career and his life. He ended up killing himself in his mid-40s. But in terms of whether Tom Wills was involved in killing Gayiri people after his father died, it seems impossible from what we've seen to know one way or the other. These ABC reports showed that, back in 2021, a researcher had found an American newspaper article which claimed to quote Tom saying he'd taken part in the killings. But it should be noted that that article also had several historical errors and was published quite a few years after the fact. But there are letters from that time which do appear to support the theory, or at least show Tom's animosity towards Aboriginal people in that region. So, for example, shortly after returning to the massacre site, he writes to his cousin and asks him to send up workers who will shoot every black they see. Back when these stories came out 4 years ago, the AFL, Cricket Australia, and the Melbourne Cricket Club said they would look into the allegations against Tom Wills. We've learnt that they commissioned a report from 2 Indigenous historians to investigate this. That report was completed in 2022 and submitted, but has never been released publicly. We managed to get hold of a copy, and in it, the historians essentially found that the evidence against Tom Wills was inconclusive, but they did say where there's smoke, there's generally fire. They also recommended the 3 sporting bodies support a broader truth-telling process to further investigate these claims.
So while you're up there, you went out to Tom Wills, the younger Tom Wills's property in the hope of meeting him. Did you ever find him?
Yes. On the drive home, I had a voicemail from the younger Tom Wills, which was great. So we ended up having a couple of chats over the phone. And when we say younger, Tom Wills, the younger, is kind of in his late 60s now. And so the original Cullen Luringo property has long been sold, but he owns a cattle station that adjoins the old property. And he's inherited all the family journals and letters and memorabilia from that time.
Well, it was all scattered everywhere, taking up too much room, so I built a shed to put it all in.
For a while, his family didn't talk about the massacres.
Well, my grandparents' era, they didn't want to talk about anything like that.
And he's adamant that Tom Wills Sr. took no part in the killing of Aboriginal people.
I didn't hold any grudges. There are a lot of people around that hold grudges, but I don't think Tommy Wills did.
He says there are letters that prove he wasn't there, at least during the first reprisal attack.
I wondered how do you feel about living in the place where this happened?
It doesn't worry me. You just pay respect for what they went through.
Mm.
And I've had a lot of Aboriginal friends. I went to school with Aborigines, but we didn't grudge against them just because of their colour.
And what about John McPherson as another Wills descendant? How did he feel after that trip to Springshore?
John might be the only member of the Wills family to believe that Tom Wills probably did kill Aboriginal people. And in terms of the trip, he said, he was moved obviously by seeing the graves of the settlers and his ancestor, but it disturbed him that there were no memorials anywhere for the Indigenous people who were killed in that region. And that lack of recognition sits very uncomfortably with him. And while doing this thesis years ago, he ended up doing a deep dive into Queensland's colonial past. So that's where he's found, a lot of these family accounts about Tom Wills's actions, and he felt like there was enough evidence there to suggest it was highly likely that he did take part. In sort of putting it in the broader historical context with other people he'd spoken to, he felt like it would have been more surprising if Tom Wills did not take part in those reprisal killings, given his attitudes and the attitudes at the time. But this whole exercise has taken a huge effect on John, to the point that he's faced some significant mental challenges.
It was mentally quite devastating.
But his own research and his time in Springshore with Daryl has made him more determined that the truth is told.
This isn't all that far in the past, and we can't just say, oh, it happened, it's not part of the now. Well, it's still very much part of the now.
So I think I want to bring Sarah Collard back in here. You heard from Sarah in episode 1 about the Bootenal Springs massacre and the diaries of Major Logue. Now, Sarah, Ella and I were all involved in this project together. And when we began this, we wanted to go and meet ordinary Australians who were struggling with the real life challenges of truth-telling and coming to a reckoning about their ancestral involvement in frontier violence and what it means for them today. And given that you've both been so immersed in this project with me, I'd love to get your insights into what are the things about this project that have stood out to you as most important about truth-telling. I might start with you, Sarah.
For me, I think some of the most interesting insights have come from people who have never really considered these topics at all. They, grew up in ignorance. They'd lived the first 50, 60, sometimes 70 years of their life not thinking about Aboriginal people and how they benefited from the dispossession and murder of Aboriginal people for decades. And I think for some of those people, it's really painful to consider how they have benefited from it personally. And a lot of them, they kind of go into these points of really beautiful clarity, and then there's almost like they hit a wall, and there's that huge fear. It's incredibly brave of these people to begin to do this work, and that takes incredible courage to look into the most brutal parts of your own history and see how you have benefited from that.
I think what struck me is that people are still really wrestling to kind of control the narrative about this kind of history. It's not uncommon on any story when you're talking to someone for them to be kind of curious about the angle you're taking on that sort of thing. But that was so heightened for me, where people want to know exactly what approach you're taking, what's the story going to say, how are they going to be portrayed. That's been tricky to navigate, trying to be honest with people, be authentic in your dealings with people who are coming at this from very different backgrounds and perspectives, and trying to, authentically represent them in the story and get their points of view across, but also not shy away from the hard truths. The other thing that struck me is that there's still so much discomfort around talking about this kind of history, particularly I think in kind of the more remote and rural parts of the country. It's something I've encountered before, but I guess, you rock up to a small town and, you're greeted with that classic country hospitality. But then when you sort of talk a bit more about what you're doing there, and you might mention, frontier violence or Aboriginal history, and the mood shifts, and, truth-telling is one thing, but whether or not people are ready to hear it and to listen is another.
I was thinking about what the local historian in Geraldton, Bruce Baskerville, told us, where he said he hoped that people could get to an agreed truth about the past, because at the moment there are two completely different stories. There's the non-Indigenous story, which to a certain extent whitewashes what really happened or doesn't tell the story from the Aboriginal perspective. And then there's the story of Aboriginal people that has been passed down through the generations about massacres that took place that the white folks say they never heard, or, got a version that was, very edited. So coming to an agreed truth about our history is an important first step. But as you say, Ella, getting people to listen is the next challenge. I'm mindful of what Fiona Counsellor told us in Geraldton, Sarah, where she said, we have to answer the call of the blood of my people. And Aboriginal people have known this history. We grew up with this. We got told these stories growing up. It's like Aboriginal people are waiting down the track, politely waiting for the white fellas to catch up.
Yes, I think that is true. And I think when they talk about the answering the call of the blood, I think in that answer they want justice. And I think that is something that a lot of people are still grappling with. What does that look like? How do people make amends? How do they reckon with this history, and what comes next after truth-telling? I hope that this project will encourage others to look in their own family trees and their own homes and see what they have, because throughout this project there's still very real artefacts that people have in their homes and in their families, backyards and basements and pantry cupboards.
And when we met other descendants, who they often said, just do it, don't be afraid to come forward, because it means so much to the other side when you do. The fear of retribution is misplaced, that people actually are ready, they're willing, and they want to kind of meet and talk about the next steps. Whether that leads to healing, we don't know, but it's important to start the process, and don't be afraid to do that. Ella, Sarah, it's been such a privilege working on this project with you. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorena.
That was Guardian Australia's Indigenous Affairs reporters Ella Archibald-Binge and Sarah Collard. You can see pictures and read articles from our Descendants project by going to theguardian.com. This is the second episode of this two-part special full story. If you haven't already, please listen to part 1 about us uncovering the story of Major Logue and his diaries. You can find it in your full story feed. If this episode has raised any issues for you, you can contact Lifeline on 131114. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners, UMOP can call 13-YARN, 139276. This episode was produced by Camilla Hannon, Karishma Luthria and Miles Martin-Yoni. Camilla also did the sound design and mix. The executive producer of Full Story is Hannah Parks, and I'm Lorena Allam.
Guardian Australia approached the AFL, Melbourne Cricket Club and Cricket Australia for comment on this story. At the time of publishing, we're yet to receive a response.